Hello everyone, welcome to the NParks OneMillionTrees Webinar. Today's session will be about what lies beneath the canopy, uncovering the science of our forests. My name is Zestin, and I'll be your host this morning. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and YouTube. For our new viewers, the 1 Million Trees movement is a nationwide effort to plant 1 million trees across Singapore over the next 10 years. Since the launch of the movement in April 2020, we have planted more than 110,000 trees alongside the community. In addition to our tree planting efforts, we have an array of other activities and resources such as our webinars and our virtual tours. So do check our website, trees.sg, and follow us on our NParks social media channels for more updates. For our Zoom viewers, my colleague Zestin has shared the links to the trees.sg website and social media pages in the chat for easy reference. So in our last webinar, our colleagues Weifeng and Zaki shared with us about what goes on behind the scenes in NParks Pasir Panjang Nursery, where the team has been hard at work nurturing tree saplings to support the 1 Million Trees movement. Today, we'll be getting a glimpse into the dynamic and exciting field of forest ecology through the eyes of our very knowledgeable and passionate speakers. I'll let our speakers tell you what they'll be talking about today. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We're very privileged to have with us Dr. Shawn Lum, a senior lecturer from NTU's Asian School of the Environment, with more than 20 years of teaching experience under his belt. We also have with us Mr. Hock, Deputy Director of the Terrestrial Biodiversity Branch in NParks National Biodiversity Centre. Both our speakers have done a lot of work in the field of forest ecology, and I'm sure they'll have a lot to share with us today. After the talk, we'll be having a short Q&A session. If you have any questions along the way, do send them to Zestin NParks as a private message using the Zoom chat, and we'll try to share some of these during the Q&A later before we wrap up. I hope you're as excited as I am to start. Shawn and Hock, please.
Hey, Wanson, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for logging on, tuning in this morning. So happy to be here together with my colleague and friend whom I've known since he was a young officer just starting out at NParks. And today he's one of the true experts in Singapore's flora and ecology, Mr. Hock Keong. I'll put on some slides here, and we can get started. Sorry, were we already there? Okay, so what we'd like to do today is to go through a kind of a chronological, give you a sort of sense of what has been done historically in terms of forest study, what we're doing today, and what are the needs of sort of forest management and conservation going forward, and how especially does the 1 million trees movement, as well as, and maybe most importantly, you and I, how do we contribute to this long-term vision of a city in nature through this 1 million trees program. I'm going to turn it over now to Hock Keong, who will walk us through some of the history of forest research in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Shawn. Are you able to see me? All right, okay, that's good. Can you go to the first slide? Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Wansin, thank you, Shawn, for giving the introduction. So my name is Hock Keong. I'm from the National Biodiversity Centre. I do a fair bit of field work, not as much as Shawn, but it's really fun doing work out there with Shawn as well. Okay, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what's been done in terms of forest research and forest ecology research in Singapore since the beginning. So we had to know that, to put this in context, 200 years ago, there wasn't so much about forest ecology research per se. A lot of the exploration then is first to find out what's out there in the forest, both in terms of plants, in terms of animals. In Singapore, a lot of things actually started very early. So it all began with Sir Stamford Raffles, Raffles, he's not just the founder of Singapore. He's also a man very interested in the flora, fauna of the places that he has been, not just in Java where he first started, but also in Singapore. When he first came to Singapore, he also started collecting plants, but he doesn't know what they are. So he sent his collections to his friend, Dr. William Jack, at the time was based in Penang, who later came down to Singapore. So he had this very weird looking pitcher plant that you see in a photo. And he brought it to William Jack. And Jack saw that it's something that's new to science and promptly named it after Raffles and called it Nepenthes rafflesiana. Soon after, Jack came down to Singapore and did a lot more collections. He published about them. Unfortunately, he passed away very soon after, so I don't have a photo of how, William Jack. We don't know how he looks like. But that actually started the beginnings of forest research in Singapore. There was a lot of back and forth with Dr. Nathaniel Walik, who was actually based in Calcutta at the time. He came down to Penang, Malacca, and Singapore to recuperate from some illness, and he spent 6 months in Singapore, hosted by Sir Stafford Raffles. And later, he helped with the creation of the first botanical gardens at Fort Canning. He drew up the plans for it. And actually that started a whole lot of era of research. But at the beginning, things was not that easy. Next slide. Right, so in the next 60 to 80 years or so, even though there was a start by William Jack and Nathaniel Walik, there isn't so much on research in ecology itself. So a lot of the efforts was more looking at what are the forest products that can be gotten, that can be used for mankind. What are there that we can actually use as products for profit, for enterprise. The main plant that actually came out from Singapore at the time was this Palacum gutta, which produces a latex. It was brought by William Montgomery to the United Kingdom, and he showed it to a lot of chemists, and they found actually it has a lot of potential for users. And the main use it had at that point of time was for submarine cables. It's used to coat submarine cables that goes underneath the ocean, and it helps with the insulation, and it protects the cable from the seawater. Subsequently, Sir Alfred Russel Wallace actually visited Singapore, and he not just collected insects and animals, he also collected some plant samples, which are now lodged in the Kew Botanical Gardens, as well as the Edinburgh Herbarium. These are just small steps at the beginnings of botanical research in Singapore. Next slide. Later, when Nathaniel Kenley, who was engaged by the colonial government to take over the botanical gardens, that's when things really got a big start. The government at that point in time realizes that Singapore is losing its forests at a very fast rate. The pepper and gambia plantations was taking over the forest, was clearing a lot of the forest in Singapore. The nutmeg plantations was also taking over the grasslands left by the pepper and gambia plantations at the point in time. So they were curious, now how much forest is there left in Singapore to be used? They commissioned Nathaniel Kenley to do a survey of the entire Singapore, and he found that at the point of time, nearly 80 to 90% of the primary forest is already gone. So he quickly put up a proposal to set aside about 10% of the land as forest reserves. He also started the first herbarium in Singapore, because prior to that, all the botanists and all the collectors, after they've collected their specimens, they kind of put it in Singapore because there was no herbarium. They all had to lodge it either in Kew Botanic Gardens, other herbariums in Europe, or even in the US. Now, from that time onwards, we have our very own herbarium to put all the plant specimens in Singapore. Ridley continued the work by Kenley. He surveyed not just Singapore, as well as Malaya, and he actually published the very first flora of Singapore in 1900. Based on that work, he also published later the flora of the Malay Peninsula, And right now, there is no publications that have yet surpassed the breadth of what he has done in that series in the flora of Malay Peninsula. Next slide. From 1900 onwards, things started to get a little bit slow because there were tensions between Ridley and the colonial government. The government decided that, okay, forests don't go under authority of the botanical gardens. And we put it under the land office because forests are meant to be used. So a lot of the focus shifted away from research in the forest, research from botany, towards research for agricultural use. They got Isaac Burkill to join the gardens and basically got him to reorganize the botanical gardens and not so much into research. But Burkill, he realizes what needed to be done. He uses his own expertise on Dioscorea, in other words, which is yams, that is known at that point in time. And that kept the colonial masters happy. He also started the beginnings or the foundations of botanical research in Singapore by hiring young botanists to start to do research on ferns, on orchids, palms. So he got in Professor Hotham, Furtado, Mr. Henderson, and with their work from the 1920s onwards, it set up Singapore as the center of scientific identification of plants in Malaya, because at the point in time, even in Malaya, there is no quality herbarium to do this sort of work. So all the plant samples collected by any botanist come to Singapore for identification. Next slide. When John Connor joined the Singapore Botanical Gardens, that is when we managed to put the word ecology into forest research. Before that, it was a lot of exploration about taxonomy, about what plants are out there, about describing new species. Connor, he was hired as a mycologist, which means he is an expert in fungi. At the same time, he had a lot of interest in forests as well. So he went around in his free time around the forest in Singapore as well as in Malaya, and he found that in Singapore there actually are freshwater swarm forests, and he actually discovered the Jurong freshwater swarm forest and the Mandai freshwater swarm forest, unfortunately at the time when these forests are being cleared. So he mapped out the distribution of the different tree species as well as their location and set up plots, and he took photographs to document how the structure of this freshwater swarm forest looks like before they were actually gone. It was actually not a bad thing in the sense that he's able to capture a cross section with the cleared ground in front of him and then the forest interior at the back, which would not have been possible if the forest was not being cleared. Of course, it is also not a good thing because the forest is being cleared at the point in time. That photos that you see of the Jurong swarm forest was taken in 1932. By 1934, the forest is gone and all turned into pineapple plantations. Next slide. During the war, things got a bit difficult, understandably. A lot of the scientists are no longer around. Hotham and John Connor actually stayed in Singapore under the Japanese, under the eyes of the Japanese imperial government, but they continued some of the work together with Japanese scientists, even though they are based in the botanical gardens. After the war, there was a lot of picking up the pieces by the colonial government at the point in time. So a lot of rebuilding efforts was ongoing. Therefore, the focus again was not so much on forest ecological research. However, the scientists that came and took up positions in Singapore realizes that it actually it is an opportunity to find out what's there now that a lot of the forest there is gone. And we have people like Hotham who continue on the work. After he retired from the botanical gardens, he took up a professorship in the University of Malaya, at the time the precursor of University of Singapore. Gilliland also studied the plant communities in Singapore, both in the primary forest as well as in the secondary forest. Sinclair did a lot of surveys. Chulik, which is the start of the transition in administration from the colonial government to Singapore government. So he's actually a Singaporean, and he was groomed to study the botanical reaches in Singapore as well. Ronald Hill looked at soil moisture in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and also did a vegetation map of Singapore. So these are important foundations of ecological research that actually provided the basis for future research in Singapore. When Singapore started on the Garden City Greening Program, a lot of the tree species were instant trees. And after some time, the public servants realizes, hey, a lot of trees actually are not doing that well. Now, is there any way to know what can be done to improve it? And they realizes that there is not enough information in the Parks and Recreation Department of Singapore to actually improve on the plantings and improve on keeping the trees healthy. So therefore, it led to Mr. Wong Yu Kwan, who was hired then, to get more scientists to join, or more botanists to join the National Parks Board at the time. Next slide. Right. So Mr. Wong Yu Kwan, he got people to study what sort of trees are suitable to be planted along the roadsides, along the parks in Singapore, what can actually enhance the streetscape through colors, and what are these trees that are more resilient to diseases and more resilient to insects, predators. In the university side, Richard Collett, he joined and he actually looked at the tropical ecology of trees in Singapore. He looked at the different phrenology, the different years where trees are actually flowering and fruiting, what is actually feeding on those trees and actually dispersing those fruits. And a lot of other scientists came on after that to continue on the good work, including Dr. Shawn Lum over here. Next slide. That brings us to today. What we have been doing as NParks so far, we are continuing a lot of ecological work as well as the botanical and taxonomical work. We had done studies of the Nee Soon Swamp Forest, and it's still ongoing, and including looking at how it might respond to climate change. We've done the resurveys of Bukit Timah Nature Reserve since the last massive survey in the 1990s. We've discovered new species like the Syndaxens lucens, which was first recorded in Singapore in 2015. We have botanists from the Singapore Herbarium going deep into our forest to look at whether the trees or the plants that were there recorded by past scientists, whether they are still there or not, to provide an update on the health of these species. Next slide. The text, as I mentioned, the taxonomic research continues, and now we are taking it a step further. We're also looking at the DNA, the molecular techniques of this plant species as well. We have also embarked on the Flora of Singapore, which is a 10-year project to document and publish about all the plant species, especially the native species, that are found in Singapore ever since the beginning. We are also looking at the phenology of plants and animals as well, continuing on the work by Richard Collett. And these are important for the conservation of this species because you realize that a lot of the trees and plant species or the herb species, they mainly reside in our primary forest and some of them in the secondary forest. Now, how do we ensure their long-term survival in the forest? How do we bring them out? And without knowledge of the ecology of this species, it is actually very hard to just bring these plants out and plant them and along the roadsides and in the parks because they may not survive. We look not just at trees, we look at lianas, we look at shrubs, we look at herbs, which could be orchids, which could be rare grasses, as well as epiphytes, quite a lot of species over there. Next slide. Of course, it's not just pure research alone. We also enjoy a lot of the work along the way. We also look at what are the fruits there are in the jungle. Whenever they start to flower and fruit, we try to collect them as much as possible to propagate them, to make sure they are available to grow the next generation. We try to see what are the species that may be the wild relatives of the domesticated fruits. Of course, we can't eat all of them. So those images that you see with the fruits that we put in our mouths, those are not edible. We learned, but we didn't put them in our mouths. But the ones in the Garcinia, these are from the mangosteen family. These are actually quite nice to eat. And the Phyllium is a wild relative of the rambutan that we know. This actually looks a lot like rambutan, but it only flowers and fruits every few years. So this is a gist of what NParks we have been doing so far. And Shawn Lum is going to take us through what, from the academic side, they have been doing a lot of research as well. Shawn, over to you.
Thank you, Keong. Thank you very much. I just want to maybe for my section, basically say what have we learned through 25 years of research, very detailed study of the forest, and how can these findings help guide us as we embark on this 1 million trees movement, of which you and I are a vital part. So the context here is, if we look at the change in forest cover in Singapore, in a way, it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening all over the world today. And much of the island, as most of you know, was primary forest, the kind you can find, say, in the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. The pink refers to something called freshwater swamp forest, which Keong referred to a little bit, and the green is mangrove. But by the 1870s, as Keong said, the forests had really shrunk because of widespread plantation agriculture. And we were just left with a few rainforest reserves, such as Ang Mo Kio, Bukit Timah, Chan Chu Kang, which is up in the Yishun area. The other reserves were mainly mangrove type. And so this type of reduction or fragmentation often leads to reductions in species diversity. So if you look at the left-hand side of this famous diagram done by the late Navjot Sodhi, Professor Navjot Sodhi of NUS, you'll see green bars and blue. The green bars represent the percentage of flora and fauna we know for sure to have gone extinct, or we're quite sure. The things that we've collected in the past cannot find today. And so these range from something like 25% of our documented plants we can't find anymore, to maybe 30 to 40% of some of the freshwater fish or mammals. But much of the collection work was done in the 1870s and onward, after much of the natural areas had been cleared. So the assumption, and I think it's a fair one, that Professor Sodhi made, was that maybe many of the species that we had already disappeared by the time there was collection done in a systematic way. So the blue bars represent what the research team called the possible extinctions. So it's a little bit higher. Actually, it's not as alarming as these blue bars suggest. More recent work by Professor Ryan Chisholm at NUS suggests that actual extinctions are slightly more than known extinctions, but the numbers are still high. Half of our birds, half of our mammals, half of our fish, 30% of our plants. And then the question is, to what extent do these species losses impact the functionality of these ecosystems? Can forests still work like forests originally did? And so that leads us to a study that my colleagues and I have been doing for the past 25 years at the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, where we've basically done a very detailed long-term study on a small part of the forest, about 4 hectares. Bukit Timah is the largest contiguous or remaining single piece of primary forest at about 50 hectares, which is 100 football fields. It's like about half a square kilometer. That represents 1/4 of all remaining primary forests in Singapore. Bukit Timah is very typical of Singapore's forest in being what's called a mixed dipterocarp forest, a forest dominated by a group of plants that are related to a Meranti, the flowers of Meranti on the left, and this thing called Keruing or Dipterocarpus on the right. But what has Bukit Timah told us about drastic reductions in habitat and how these forests function? So I'll run you through some of these examples. Now, there's Bukit Timah in the 1950s. Even from this black and white photo, you can see high forest, and you can see so high forest, and young recovering forest. That's the dairy farm, that U-shaped area, which has filled in completely 45 years later by 1993. And so forest recovery from scratch can happen very quickly, as this shows you. Look at all the lack of forest on the left and the forest recovery on the right, but the core area of tall trees is more or less in the same spot. It hasn't really extended out. So what we wanted to do was to examine a number of things. So the question of, does species loss, does fragmentation, sorry, my cat changed the slide, does fragmentation lead to species loss? And the answer, I believe, is yes. Surveys done at Bukit Timah in the 1990s and just in the past 5 years have showed that there have been very slight but discernible reductions in mammals, birds, and plants in the past 30 years. 1 or 2 species that were found in the 90s have been difficult to relocate in the 2020s. Work done, including by Zestin, who you will send your questions to later, on bees, other work on beetles and butterflies, show that Bukit Timah, although not surveyed in the 90s, when surveyed recently, does not have these groups of insects species of these groups that you would normally expect in a primary forest. We can still find some of these in the larger Central Catchment Nature Reserve, but not so much at Bukit Timah. So do species decline following fragmentation? The answer is yes, but I'll qualify that and I'll explain it hopefully later. The second issue is, what about biomass, the amount of tree matter that's there? And our views are very strongly shaped by a study done in the Amazon by Thomas Lovejoy and more recently William Lawrence. And this is called the biological dynamics of tropical forest fragments. What they did was they took a piece of Amazon that was slated to be cleared for cattle ranching and divided the remaining forest into different fragment sizes, from the size of a football pitch to 10 football pitches and larger, and looked at the fate of these fragments over time. And what they found was that in just a few years, many of these fragments, especially the smaller ones, lost a very high proportion of their large trees, immediate losses almost of large animals, and the diversity also declined. And what's also very interesting and important to note is that they were able to describe what they called edge effects. So when you take a forest and isolate it, now the interior of that forest is exposed to light, the drying effects of wind, and so on, in a way that doesn't usually happen in an intact forest. And they could detect edge effects deep into the forest, 200-300 meters even, where there are declines in biomass and tree species diversity far from the edge of the forest. So that basically shaped the views of people all around the world. And so when I started with my colleagues on the study of Bukit Timah, the consensus generally seemed to be that Bukit Timah was a forest in decline. I wouldn't say a dying forest, but a forest in decline. So what did we find? My colleague Ngo Kang Min published a biomass paper. And if you look at the top panel, you'll see there's a little arrow indicating Bukit Timah. It's on the lower end of average, but it's certainly within the expected biomass, tree matter of Asian tropical forest. And it's still quite a bit higher than most forests, say in Amazonia or in the neotropics. So whether there was a loss of biomass or not, there was not a catastrophic collapse of biomass in Bukit Timah the way it might have been predicted. So I think that's good. I was relieved. But furthermore, they looked at numbers of species, numbers of individuals, and it seemed like the forest was relatively resilient. How about this question of are forests that are fragmented susceptible to exotic or invasive species? If you look at this map of Bukit Timah, the red dots represent, that's the area that used to be the dairy farm. And it has been, if you will, colonized by exotic species, the African tulip. So at first that's alarming. You say, oh no, the exotic species from Africa is taking over our nature reserve. But actually, two things: African tulip has not established within the existing native dominated forest. So it didn't displace native trees where they were growing. And secondly, when we do a survey underneath the African tulip trees, all the species are native ones for the most part. So basically the exotic species just provides cover to allow regeneration of the native forest to come in underneath. So again, that I found very encouraging. We don't necessarily need to spend lots of money and manpower to remove some of these exotic trees if the understory is recovering and dominated by a native species, which they seem to be doing. So that's good. These forests are generally resilient. How about those losses of animals? The half of the mammals, half of the birds, and so on. Has that impacted pollination? Has it led to reductions in the dispersal of trees and their subsequent reestablishment or nutrient cycling? So we did a few studies on these, some of them more anecdotal. This is a nutmeg species, Horsfieldia, but here's a nutmeg fruit from the forest. This is something called Myristica, quite related to our cultivated nutmeg. And this species tends to be dispersed by large birds, such as the biggest hornbills, like the rhinoceros hornbills. It might be moved by large monkeys, such as gibbons. We have neither of these in our forest today. But when we actually looked at the distribution of these plants that are traditionally or customarily, should I say, dispersed by large animals, we couldn't find any statistical evidence that there has been a loss of just a restricted distribution of these species. And we asked, well, what could be going on? So the first thing is that, there's the rhinoceros hornbill. The first could be that there are a few remaining vertebrates, not many, but of large size, such as the long-tailed macaque or civet cats. They still exist in our forests. And it seems that maybe these animals are able to pick up the slack that was vacated when we lost some of the larger vertebrates. So again, we might have reduced diversity of large animals in our forests, but the remaining ones appear to be doing their job. And when we did a study of what's called secondary seed dispersal, meaning large seeds or small seeds fall to the ground, other animals pick them up and move them around and sometimes hide them, such as this plantain squirrel with a large seed in its mouth. And what we did was we tracked the movement of these seeds being carried by secondary dispersers such as forest rats and plantain squirrels. And we were pleasantly surprised to find that these animals are moving these seeds 20, 30 meters or more, sometimes burying them in the soil. They eat a few, but there are many that survive predation. And so secondary seed dispersal may be also partly compensating for the loss of some of our original large-bodied seed dispersers. It doesn't mean that we can lose large animals, but smaller animals may be able to hold the fort and keep that function going until the forest might recover to a more diverse state in future. And I'm just going to move. There are some animals such as this cave nectar bat. They might be able to actually cross the urban suburban matrix from move to forest patch to forest patch. So there are a few animals still doing the job, a very important job. Now, this is one thing to look out for, though. I think we should keep an eye out. We have the return of the wild boar, which is a large-bodied seed predator. With the return of the wild boar in large numbers, will this tip the balance towards the predation of seeds, their destruction, and away from dispersal? And there are studies being done by national parks and university colleagues to actually see what this impact might be. So please stay tuned, but I think the authorities are monitoring the situation. Let me explain this one. This is Koompassia. By the way, if you look at the background, I see Hock Keong's background. There's the 1MillionTrees logo. There's that tree. That's not a make-up tree. That's something called the Koompassia or Kumpas in Malay. And there's a study of Koompassia by Ted Webb and Lab. Thanks, Hock Keong, for pointing that out. These lines, if you look at the panel of figures on the right, those lines represent the movement of a pollen grain from one tree to another. So using genetics, Ted Webb, Anika Noreen, and colleagues were able to actually follow the movement of pollen. And from the top, this is the movement of pollen from McRitchie. So you can see pollens going from McRitchie all the way across to Bukit Timah, and from McRitchie all the way down to the Botanic Gardens. And that's not contiguous forests. There's homes and shopping centers and all this kind of stuff. And yet the pollinators can connect these, just these separated forest fragments. And they move from Bukit Timah to McRitchie and Bukit Timah to the Botanic Gardens. And likewise, they move from Botanic Gardens to McRitchie. So what this means is that we still have some pollinator function that's able to overcome, to some extent, this fragmentation. Again, a very hopeful indication that our forests have been able to hang on until we can restore them even further with the 1 million trees and other initiatives. And there are also new discoveries from small fragments like Bukit Timah. Not just little things like Hanguana neglecta, which we've just overlooked over time, mammals like the red-cheeked flying squirrel found in a survey, the 1990s survey, big trees, the Shoria ocrofloia, a type of Moranti, one of the biggest trees in Bukit Timah, not described until 1994, or Gluta malayana, a wild relative of mango, which irritates your skin, hence Nick really, Faizu, handling it with care there. We're finding new things through these expeditions by Singapore Botanic Garden staff and others. Again, really hopeful, gives me hope. So it leaves me just to kind of conclude this section to try to understand what have we learned about Bukit Timah. So Bukit Timah is no doubt a compromised ecosystem. It's fragmented, it's lost some species, but does it still work? And I use the analogy to this car that I first learned to drive on. This is not the actual car, this is the same model. My father owned a 1970s Dodge Charger. By the time I started driving it in the 80s, it was rusted and kind of falling apart, but it still worked. And it made me think, well, what if you started stripping away parts of a car? What could you afford to lose before it doesn't have a function? And you could actually lose a lot. You could take away a rear view mirror, side view mirror, doors, bonnet, windscreen, and you're left, as long as you have wheels and a chassis, you're left with the Flintstones type vehicle, and it still works. And I'm not saying that Bukit Timah is in such a shabby state, like it's a automobile turned into a Flintstones car, by no means, but even a slightly diminished system can still function and retain its functionality, at least until we can step in and manage it actively and try to bring it back to its something closer to the original state, which NParks are doing through the Forest Restoration Action Plan. Size does matter of these fragments. So some, as you can see, there's green patches, these are fragments. Some are large and self-sustaining, like the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, but others maybe, I've circled here the rainforest at the Botanic Gardens. These are ones to watch because they are in the 3, 4, 5 hectare size range and isolated. We need to see if these can retain their resilience in the same way that, say, Bukit Timah has retained its resilience. Here's a little fragment behind Thompson Plaza, another one on the right. There's a Shoria or Moranti that's found near the Mandai Road. So we should keep an eye on all of these different fragments, which some of my colleagues across NParks and the universities are in fact doing. We have lots of fragments, some to monitor and some to restore, such as Yishun Park or the Southern Ridges, Jurong Hill. So this is really an exciting moment for forest study and management in my mind. So general takeaways. Forests are resilient, but we need to know what is that threshold size below which they maybe start to unravel slightly. There are species losses, but they are minimal enough for us to maybe reverse the curve. A replacement of trees and individuals and species certainly seems to be occurring. So, and biomass is stable and forest function continues. But, and here's the big but, the question is, how quickly does a secondary or regenerating forest return back to primary forest? And all evidence suggests that it takes a very long time indeed. So this is almost a paradox. The fragments that we have remaining are resilient, but the areas that are not primary forests seem to take an extremely long period of time to recover, if left on their own to recover. And that's where I think our efforts through 1 Million Trees and other initiatives and further monitoring research has to step in. You can even see it if here's a view from McRitchie. I stole this from one of my students, not stole, borrowed from a student report. If you can see the up and down canopy, those are the original primary forest fragments with the emergent species there providing the contours. And all the blue line, which is more or less even, that's secondary forest. 150 years after isolation, you can still pick out very clearly what's the remaining patches of forest and what's the regenerated. So you can see that these secondary forests are prime candidates for further help through programs like forest restoration. And there's luckily a whole slew. Oh, beautiful. Boching did work marvels on this slide. It's really nice now. These are the names of some of the colleagues that you can work with and collaborate with and support who are working on trying to better understand our forests. And maybe I can take that up during Q&A. And we need to know more about microbes, for example. Here's a fungus that lives in a symbiotic relationship with some of our forest trees. And that's what I've learned and what we've learned as a community. And I think Hock will take us through some of the challenges of forest restoration. Hock.
Thanks very much, Shawn. Thanks for the wide coverage of the research that has been done in recent years by colleagues both in the universities as well as covering those that we've done in the Singapore Botanic Gardens and National Parks Board. Now, as Shawn have mentioned, primary forest takes a long time to recover into secondary forest. Now, what are the challenges that we face in trying to make that process faster? Now, if we leave nature to do its job on its own, they can do their job perfectly fine. You just need to give them 500 to 1,000 years. We may not have that much time to see the fruits of that happening. At the same time, Singapore may or may not have that much time to allow these trees to go through their natural process in building from primary forest and expanding out into the rest of the secondary forest. So the challenges of that lies in the very nature of primary forest trees, not just in Singapore, but also in the region as well as elsewhere. Shawn has talked about Singapore being lowland dipterocarp forest. An example of dipterocarp forest, if you go to Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, are those huge columnar trees that you see on your left and your right as you walk along the main path. Now, these trees takes about 300 to 400 years old to get to where they are today. Now, imagine when Raffles came to Singapore at the point of time, these trees were already there in their teenage years for the trees. To give an example, a dipterocarp forest, or dipterocarp tree takes about between 20 to 30 years to become mature. And these trees do not flower and fruit every year. They follow what we call a general flowering syndrome or phenomenon. Some people call it mass flowering event, some call it mass fruiting event. But generally, this follows the El Nino cycle, which happens once every between 3 to 5 or even 10 years. The last 20 years of observations shows that a massive mass flowering and fruiting event with lots of fruit set actually occurs roughly between once every 8 to 10 years. And that is a long time. So if a tree only produces enough fruit once every 10 years, and the fruits actually disperse, say, 20 meters away from the parent tree, and that same crop of fruit 20 meters away start to grow a new tree and takes another 30 years to grow into a mature size, into a young adult tree, for example. So it takes just 50 years for that particular parent tree to grow its next generation that's able to reproduce further. It takes 50 years to go 30 meters. So imagine you put that in time scale of humans, that is extremely, extremely slow. Of course, for the trees, these are natural. These are part of their natural process. They live on time scales of hundreds of years. So having a crop every few years and expanding their range every about 30 or 50 meters in 100 years is normal for them. But we have to understand that in our case, we have to grow them faster. We have to give them a leg up. We have to really get them kickstarted. So in Singapore, a lot of these primary forest fragments are what they are. They are fragments, but they are embedded within a huge matrix of secondary forests. The research that we are doing is important because we need to find out where these trees are, whether they are really regenerating, where is their coverage of the population. And it is very important to know that because we need to know how many of these trees are left. In the event that some of these trees have only a few individuals, then what can be done? Example is the Dipterocarpus elongatus, which we found some at Mandai. I was very happy when we saw 2 big trees there producing crop. We have young saplings around. And the next flowering season that I went there about 5 years later, I can't find the trees anymore. And I looked up and I realized, oh my God, both two big trees are dead because of lightning strike. And that got us really, really worried because then we will have to wait another 30 years before the next generation of trees actually grow up to become mature trees and produce the next crop. Luckily, we managed to find in a different location in Merigi another population, small but reproducing population of these trees. So that actually was a sign of relief. Now the next question is, can we actually keep all these seeds over the few years before we are ready to grow them? A lot of these primary forest trees they produce recalcitrant seeds, meaning if you don't plant them out and let them germinate within the next 1 to 2 months, they die. You can't put them in dry storage because they will die there. You can't freeze them because they will die there. They are not orthodox seeds, which you can actually put in the seed bank. So we actually have to take take a percentage of the seeds that we find once these trees actually have flowers and fruited and start to grow them in the nursery. We actually have to set aside space to grow them into young saplings in order to plant them out, in order to get them ready for places that we want them to expand into, and not just keep them as seeds. And so these are some of the challenges we have when we're trying to do forest restoration. You can't buy these plants off the shelf. They are simply not commercially available. Even in other countries where you have the same species, you can't buy their seeds. They are not if they are not flowering in Singapore, they are not flowering elsewhere as well. And each time the process, we have to wait 3, 4, sometimes 5, 6 years just to know whether a particular species is flowering or not. And so that is a lot of monitoring work that we have to do by our colleagues. Next slide. Now, bringing that message across, what then do we need to know in order to grow the next generation? How do we make the primary forest boundaries expand beyond into the secondary forest? Secondary forests are good because they provide habitats, they help ameliorate the climate, they help buffer the primary forest edge. At the same time, it allows the animals and the dispersals to bring seeds from the primary forest out and grow them in the secondary forest. But we still need to know a lot more about these 3 species. What are their mycorrhizal symbiotic relationship with fungi? Because they actually depend on this microbial and mycorrhizal network in the soil to get nutrients for the trees itself. And a lot of them, even, for example, the ground orchids, if they are seeds, you put them in agar gel, they will not germinate. They actually have to be infected by particular mycorrhizal or fungi in order to germinate. So these are relationships that we still need to do a lot of research about in order to help grow the next generation. What are the animals that pollinate our plants? For example, we have the Dureo graffiti, Dureo singaporensis over there with the flower. So who pollinates these flowers once every few years when they actually start to flower? Who actually eats the fruits that they produce, like the echolalia, you see, this basically drop all around below the tree, who helps to disperse them away from the parent tree in order to grow the next generation. Who are the ones that actually eats the seeds of the guia, the small fruits, or even the big fruits, the aglaia fruits that I'm holding in my hand, such huge tennis-sized red-colored balls that actually split open with huge seeds inside. What other animals actually eats them and disperse them away from the parent trees? So a lot of these are still unknown, and therefore we need to put in a lot more research into understanding the ecology of our primary rainforest, not just the primary rainforest, but also the secondary forest. What are their growth requirements? If the environment changes, what is the impact on them? How are they resilient to our climate change? And what can we do to buffer them, to grow them beyond the current boundaries? Next slide. And therefore, the question is more than just the research that needs to be done. We actually need the research to plug the knowledge gaps. We need technology. We need to know, for example, how to monitor the flowering, who are the pollinators, who are dispersers, right up at the canopy. There's not a lot of research done in the canopy because that is really a hard place to study. Not many of us can actually climb out of the tree and stay up there long term to look at plants and flowerings if we know it's flowering at all. These are the knowledge gaps that needs to be filled up. What's important is we need to get the next generation of young scientists. We need to get the next generation of botanists. We need to start young. We need to start from schools, get students interested to know about our forests, and we will involve them in planting events. For example, the 1 Million Tree Program is a very, very good platform to get people interested to know about our trees. So the story is that they are not just planting trees for show, definitely it's not for show. They're planting trees to increase the buffer that we have beyond our forest boundaries. They're planting trees, native trees, to make sure that our primary forest trees are no longer stuck in their primary forest confines, but are able to move out through human intervention into our secondary forest and even beyond into the forest age. That's where a lot of research are important, because then if we know what sort of conditions are required to grow them, we can create the conditions suitable so that these trees, after they're planted, they actually can grow very well and start the next generation. We really encourage students to do a lot of this research. It doesn't matter whether they have to publish in a high-profile scientific journal. Observations, if they can publish in their social media platform, they can publish in our Garden Wise, they can publish in Gardens Bulletin, in the university's Nature in Singapore journal. These are places where observational data can go in and it benefits everyone. And that actually helps with the 1 Million Tree Program because it gets everybody involved. So they're not just planting trees, but they're also planting the future for Singapore's forests. I think that's where we really need to work on. Next slide. I think that's where we are ending off.
You know, Hock, I mean, if I could just add to your wish list, I mean, I would just say so the 1 million trees and other initiatives really are kind of a physical transformation of the landscape, right? To make it more livable, make it more resilient, make it more biodiverse, which is important. But the other side of the 1 million trees, I think you and I are in agreement, we've talked about this, is that it's also hopefully going to help transform all of us. So those seeds are not just planted in the ground, but they're really planted really in our hearts, that we really view our relationship with nature and the role we play in it and it plays in our lives and the importance it has, so that we actually, in a way, come to a new kind of equilibrium with the natural world. I think that that's going to be the transformative power of the 1 Million Trees movement. And we're both from NParks, academics, community groups, we're all trying to we're aligning and getting behind this, and hopefully you'll be a big part of that too.
So we are not just planting trees, we are planting the seeds of nature in people's heart.
That's right. That's right. And you're doing a lot. Once in, I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shawn and Hock for a very illuminating and fascinating talk on forest ecology. So I think our audience has a lot of questions for today. We've had quite an overwhelming response. I apologize in advance if we're not able to answer every question. So our first question is about how much of our forests are primary forests and where can they be found? Shawn and Hock,
yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
So basically, Singapore used to be covered 100% primary forest 200 years ago. By 1900, we've left with less than 1%. And that's where we are, that's our starting base, and we've started growing from there. The largest contiguous primary forest, as Shawn mentioned earlier, is the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, but there are pockets of primary forest embedded within a matrix of secondary forest, mature secondary forest, elsewhere within the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, in Mandai, in Merici, at Chestnut area. So they are around, scattered within our nature reserves. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, and the next question, are there studies done on carbon sequestration in Singapore by our native forests? Maybe, Shawn, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wanson. My colleague at NTU, Dr. Ngo Kang Min, has published a paper focusing on Bukit Timah, comparing the primary and secondary forests and looking at the carbon storage. Turns out that the primary forest contains about 30 to 40% more carbon per unit area than the secondary, which means that I think through forest restoration, we'll be able to put away a bit more carbon. Then work done by Chow Lok Ming at NUS, Professor Chow, and after that, Dan Fries at the NUS Geography Department has looked at carbon sequestration in mangrove forests. And these are really awesome storage stores of carbon as well. So these are ongoing. And I think NParks has continued the sort of long-term monitoring of carbon sequestered across all our forests and managed green spaces as well.
Okay, Hock, would you like to add anything on studies?
We've actually done studies of carbon biomass throughout the whole Singapore. We've categorized using satellite imagery and into what kind of forests they are, whether they are primary forests, they are regrowing forests, in parkland, and other types of greenery, not just in forests. And we use it to estimate the carbon biomass that we have in Singapore. And this is done every few years so that we can have a snapshot to monitor the increase or decrease of carbon biomass in Singapore. And that is important because we do have to report our carbon emissions to the international platform, and that's under the UNFCCC program. And therefore, having this information, this data is important to help us with our reporting. So yes, we are actually doing our monitoring of the carbon sequestration in our native forests.
Okay, thank you both. I think we only have time for one last question. So how can an average citizen and or student contribute to forest ecology research?
Anyone who contributes to forest ecology monitoring research is anything but average. You're a hero to me and Hock and to everybody. But many ways to do it. Active participation could include joining a friends group, say Friends of Chestnut Nature Park, Friends of Bukit Timah, where forest study and restoration is a part of it. You know, there'll be a Friends of Rifle Range Nature Park and so on. That's one. Taking part in a citizen science initiative. These could range from, say, the bio blitzes that NParks do to the NParks Garden Birdwatch and others that monitor wildlife are important. You can take part in something that my colleagues at Nature Society run also called Every Singaporean a Naturalist. So that's citizen science, that's another big part of it. Studying with some of the masters of ecology locally could allow you to take on a career in forest ecology research, like you, Wansin, or Rachel, or Zestin, who are my colleagues at NParks. And finally, I think just to put in a good word, whether in writing, thank our colleagues in the agencies for pushing these initiatives, thank your MP and say, this is really important to us. I think that's in some ways the kind of biggest moral support that we can get. And I can't cannot overemphasize how important that is, because it's when people speak up that these are seen as important issues, not just to ecologists, but to every one of us in Singapore. Hock, anything to add there?
Just to add a bit more, just to break down the barrier between people wanting to contribute in forest ecology research. It's not a science that is out of reach of the average Singaporean. It's not a science that only scientists and botanists can do. If you look at the Gardens Bulletin 100 years ago, 50 years ago, a lot of the articles were actually published by amateurs who actually have an interest in observing the nature around them. If you look at today's nature in Singapore, or even in Garden-wise, a lot of the articles was actually done by amateurs. They are not scientists, they are not botanists, but they have an interest to do research, to put down in writing their observations and share that, not just with Singaporeans, but with everybody, share them publicly. So that, in a way, helps to contribute to our knowledge in forest ecology research. Not just any student, but average citizens, normal Singaporeans, anyone can do that as well. So hopefully that will encourage people, to encourage the next generation to start looking at what's around them in the forest and doing observations of their own and writing them down.
Okay, and with that, I think that's the end of our Q&A. I'd like to thank Shawn and Hock for giving us a better understanding of what goes on in our forest, and I've personally really enjoyed the talks today. Also, a very big thank you to our audience on Zoom and YouTube for joining us today. So our next webinar would be on 9th January, 4 p.m. and will be on about growing the next generation, an educator's perspective. So do keep a lookout for the sign-up link on trees.sg or our mailing list. The 1 Million Trees movement is going strong and we'll need more hands on deck. So do check out our website, trees.sg, and connect with us on NParks social media channels. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, Twitter, and YouTube. A million thanks to all for attending this session, and have a great day ahead.